The air inside the Jefferson County Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama, felt thick with tension, a tension rooted not in the steamy weather outside but in the unspoken truths that lingered within these walls. Judge Meredith Langford had ruled this courtroom for 24 years, a reign marked not by the kind of legacy that would end up on a plaque but by whispered fears about her injustices. She was known for her unwavering disdain for those who dared to challenge her, her sharp gaze cutting through attorneys like they were nothing more than nuisances. The day was no different as Donnell Hayes approached the defense table, his Polish shoes clicking against the marble. Today, he wasn't just any attorney. He was a man on a mission, and he wasn't about to back down against the formidable judge, a judge who had kept too many innocent lives crushed under her boot. The case of Tyrone Wilkes, a man wrongfully accused of armed robbery, was on the line. But today was not just about Tyrone. It was about making a statement that echoed through the system. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Langford said without looking up, her voice like ice, "don't waste my time. You're already on thin ice in my courtroom." Donnell gritted his teeth but maintained his calm demeanor. "I'll do my best, Your Honor." "That's all I ask," she sneered, signaling to the prosecution, a young attorney named Philip Calloway, fresh from law school and appearing all too eager to please the judge. The state was ready, of course. They always were when black defendants were in the crosshairs. Donnell felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. Every objection he raised was met with derision. Langford silenced him with a mere wave, her authority stifling. Donnell had been in many hostile courtrooms, but this was different. Langford wasn't hiding her bias. She was flaunting it. He noticed the jury's discomfort. Their shifting bodies told a tale of unease. "Your Honor, the prosecution has introduced evidence not disclosed in discovery," Donnell argued. "That's a clear violation of Brady v. Maryland. I move for an immediate mistrial." Langford barely glanced up. "Denied." The courtroom held its breath. Donnell blinked, not in shock but in strategy. "But—" Donnell pressed his lips together, steeling himself. "You're refusing to acknowledge a Brady violation." She leaned back, her lips curling. "I said denied, Mr. Hayes." He could feel the pressure of the room shifting, the murmurs of the gallery rising like a tide. This was a dangerous game, yet he felt a strange calm wash over him. He needed her to keep talking, to keep exposing herself. "Your Honor," Donnell continued, "if you sustain your decision, we are setting a dangerous precedent here, one that undermines the integrity of this court and the rights of the accused." Langford's gaze narrowed, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of uncertainty. "You're testing my patience, Mr. Hayes." He remained still, his voice low and steady. "And your impartiality, Your Honor. I believe today will be the day that the truth finally sees the light." She slammed her gavel, echoing through the courtroom. "One more word, Mr. Hayes, and I'll hold you in contempt." The room was dead silent. Donnell's heart was racing, but he didn't back down. No one else in the gallery would say a word. But he was prepared for this. He had waited for years. He had compiled evidence against Langford, had spent countless hours gathering intel on her corruption. And today, it felt as if fate was finally laying out a chessboard, ready for him to make his move. Just then, the heavy courtroom doors swung open with a thunk that drew gasps from everyone present. Two federal agents, clad in dark suits, strode in with purpose. Judge Meredith Langford, one of them called, flashing a badge. "We need to speak with you immediately." Langford's expression shifted from confusion to irritation. "This is highly inappropriate. I am in the middle of a trial," she snapped. The second agent stepped forward with a determined look. "This is a matter of federal interest. It cannot wait." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Donnell could see the tide of uncertainty washing over Langford's composed facade. She was used to being in control, but today was different. The first agent continued, raising the stakes. "We have a warrant for your arrest." The silence that enveloped the room was thunderous. Langford's face blanched, her power stripped away in a matter of seconds. Donnell couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction, the truth finally catching up with her. "Meredith Langford," the lead agent said, stepping closer, "you are under arrest under suspicion of bribery, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights. Beneath this revelation, Donnell's mind raced. This was his moment, a battle he had prepared for, and he would not let it slip away. "Your Honor," he began, addressing the stunned courtroom, "I believe you just denied my motion for a mistrial. But it seems this trial is now the least of your concerns." Langford's demeanor faltered, her grip on her gavel tightening as if it could ground her again. "You!" She glared at Donnell, fury mingling with disbelief. "This is justice," Donnell said calmly, watching as the agents moved in to cuff her. The sound of metal snapping around her wrists echoed like the final hammer fall of a gavel. But while fate dealt its hand to Langford, the trial against Troy Wilkes was far from over. Donnell's resolve burned hotter than ever, knowing this fight was only just beginning. As Langford was led away, Donnell's heart raced. The courtroom had witnessed a reckoning, and he was determined to ensure it didn't end there. For too long, the scales of justice had been tipped. With a steady breath, he faced the jury, knowing that now, above all else, he needed to win this battle for Tyrone Wilkes. The courtroom had changed forever, and Donnell would make sure it felt the aftershocks for a long time to come. Donnell's heart raced as the gravity of what had just unfolded sunk in. Judge Langford was gone, cuffed and being led away like the criminal she had forced countless innocent people into becoming. But in the wake of her arrest, the air hummed with tension. The courtroom was caught in a liminal space between justice and chaos. Everyone knew the stakes were higher now. He couldn't afford to let this moment slip away. As the courtroom fell into stunned silence, Donnell felt the eyes of the jury on him, a mix of curiosity and disbelief written across their faces. He could sense their unease, the tide turning against the very authority that had once seemed unassailable. However, the battle wasn't won yet. Tyrone Wilkes still sat beside him, the chains of wrongful accusation still shackled around his psyche. Donnell turned to face the replacement judge who had been hastily informed of the events unfolding. The man's silver hair contrasted with a face lined with experience, his expression a careful mask of neutrality. What now? Donnell thought. He needed to strike while the moment was hot. "Your Honor," he said, projecting confidence even as adrenaline coursed through him. "Given the recent developments, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client, Tyrone Wilkes. This trial has been irreparably poisoned by Judge Langford's bias and misconduct." The new judge regarded Donnell thoughtfully but didn't immediately respond. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. An elder statesman fighting against a corrupt system. Now wasn't the time for hesitation. Donnell pressed on. "The evidence is clear. Judge Langford's rulings have tainted this entire process. My client was never afforded a fair trial under her oversight, and now that she is under arrest for serious violations of the law, I believe it is imperative that we restore some semblance of justice to this court by dismissing these charges." The jury exchanged glances. Their silent conversation spoke volumes. Some nodded as if they had been waiting for someone, anyone, to speak the truth that had long been hidden in the shadow of Langford's gavel. "I understand your fervor, Mr. Hayes," the new judge began slowly, his tone even. "But please understand, just because the circumstances have changed does not automatically negate the case against Mr. Wilkes. The evidence must be weighed carefully." Tyrone's eyes flickered with desperation, yet Donnell could see the flicker of hope igniting within him. Those moments spent locked away, the years lost. Donnell refused to let them be in vain. "If it pleases the court," he insisted, lowering his tone to convey the weight of his words, "I am prepared to present further evidence and substantiate my claim. I have the documents that detail Judge Langford's decisions that affected this trial directly. Let us not let her tarnished legacy crush the life of an innocent man." The new judge rubbed his chin thoughtfully while Donnell took this moment to gather every shred of evidence he had collected against Langford over the years. He opened the briefcase beside him, revealing folders marked with dates and case numbers. Each was a thread in a tapestry of injustice that he hoped would unravel the lies. "Just a moment, Mr. Hayes," came the hesitant voice of Philip Calloway, the young prosecutor. His usual bravado was stripped away, leaving only the remnants of a man lost without his mentor. "If we could, maybe reconsider. I mean, Can we really burden the court with this? Donnell cut through the uncertainty, his voice rising above the murmur of the gallery. Burden the court. This is not a burden, Mr. Calloway. This is a duty. Tyrone has been trapped by a corrupt system, and justice demands we take action now. The eyes of the gallery shifted again. Some appeared eager, while others seemed to wrestle with their own biases. Donnell knew that the perception of fairness was as vital as the laws themselves in the courtroom. Your Honor, Donnell continued, leaning slightly forward, I ask for clarity. Will the court dismiss these unjust charges or allow the exercise of power to overshadow the truth simply because it was once seated in the judge's chair? Without waiting for a response, Donnell retrieved a document from his case file, one that he knew could shift the scales even further. This is a transcript of Judge Langford's other rulings in cases just like Tyrone's, he declared, his finger highlighting a line on the page. Each time, the outcomes were unjust, the individuals wrongly condemned because of her personal biases. It's a pattern that can no longer be ignored. He placed the document before the judge, his heart beating to the rhythm of uncertain hope. The courtroom was on edge. People leaned forward in their seats, silently rooting for justice to prevail. The new judge examined the transcript, the room enveloped in the heavy weight of anticipation. Very well, he said after what felt like an eternity. Let's review the evidence. I will consider your request for dismissal, Mr. Hayes. With those words, the tension in the room shifted once more. Donnell felt like he had just landed a blow in a heavyweight match, one that would set the stage for everything to come. The battle had already begun, but now it felt like he was finally wresting control from the chaotic energy that had clouded this courthouse for too long. As the judge turned to the jury, Donnell sensed the fervor growing among those seated, their faces painting a picture of perceived justice amidst uncertainty. He had a fleeting moment of doubt, but it quickly dissipated under the fire of determination. Let's remember, Donnell thought, casting a glance at Tyrone, the fight is for truth, and today truth would be given a voice. This courtroom would not silence it any longer. With a potent mix of hope and defiance, the next round was upon them, and this battle might just tip the scales for good. As the judge's gaze remained fixed on the transcript Donnell had presented, the tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch. Every person present could feel the tide turning, the very air crackling with anticipation. Let's remember, Donnell thought again as he took in Tyrone's hopeful, yet anxious expression. His client had waited too long for justice. Today was the time for action. Mr. Hayes, I will allow a brief recess. I need time to review this evidence, the new judge finally announced, his voice steady yet contemplative. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. A collective sigh swept through the jury box, a mixture of relief and anxiety. Donnell turned to Tyrone, who was still processing how quickly everything had turned. You did that, he said softly, disbelief shining in his eyes. You turned the tables. Donnell offered a reassuring nod. It's not over yet, Tyrone. We still have work to do. As the court officers began ushering everyone out of the room, Donnell's mind raced. The transcripts he had presented were only the tip of the iceberg. He had spent years gathering evidence against Judge Langford, meticulously noting her every bias and unethical ruling. Today was his chance to assemble everything into a coherent narrative, a narrative that could convince not just the new judge but also the jury that justice had been long overdue. Donnell stepped outside the courtroom for a moment, the heavy oak door shutting behind him. He took a breath, trying to clear the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. The hallway was bustling, the footsteps of attorneys and courthouses echoing as they moved about their busy lives, blissfully unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred. With time running short, Donnell pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found Lisa, his paralegal. She had been instrumental in digging up the dirt on Langford, someone he could count on in a tight spot like this. Hey, it's Donnell, he said as soon as she picked up. I need you to meet me at the courthouse with everything you have on Langford. Bring the latest evidence, any documents you think could hammer this case home. We might be able to put together a killer argument before the judge reconvenes. On it, Lisa replied, her voice buzzing with enthusiasm. I'll be there in 15. Just as he hung up, a sudden realization struck him. This wasn't just about Tyrone anymore. It was about the hundreds of lives Langford had affected, people who had been sentenced unjustly under her watch. Donnell's strategy formed in his mind like a clear path cutting through fog. He planned to build a case not only for Tyrone's innocence but to expose Langford's reign of terror, a legacy of injustice that needed to be dismantled. Returning to the courtroom, he was greeted by a different atmosphere. News of Langford's arrest had spread, and whispers filled the gallery. Journalists and court staff exchanged stories as they gathered. Donnell could see the crew from the local news station setting up lights and cameras outside the courthouse, poised to capture the unfolding drama. When the court reconvened, Donnell returned to his seat, adrenaline pumping through him. The judge appeared tired but resolute as he scanned the court for order before signaling to the jury. "We'll continue with the trial," he announced, his tone measured. "Mr. Hayes, you may present your evidence regarding the motion for dismissal." Donnell nodded and rose, swallowing hard as he felt the weight of everyone's gaze on him. Drawing in a deep breath, he began. "Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate the opportunity to present further evidence that highlights the systematic failure of this trial under Judge Langford's rule." He leaned over the table, gesturing to the documents he had prepared. "What I have here are not isolated incidents, but a pattern of judicial misconduct aimed at manipulating the outcome of cases. With your permission, I'd like to call attention to specific rulings that illustrate this point." As he spoke, he could see the jury shifting their focus, leaning in as Donnell laid out the groundwork for his argument. In case number 115, Judge Langford dismissed key defense evidence that would have proven the defendant's innocence. In case number 203, she ruled against the defendant's right to counsel, a blatant disregard for due process. And most shockingly, in case number 317, the same judge ruled to accept bribe money for a favorable verdict. He paused for effect, letting the words sink in while scanning the faces before him. Some jurors showed shock, others skepticism. "Your Honor, I've compiled these cases to demonstrate a clear precedent. It reveals a troubling pattern of bias that undermines the very essence of justice." The new judge furrowed his brow, reviewing the documentation. Donnell continued, "With the recent developments surrounding the arrest of Judge Langford, it is imperative that we acknowledge the gravity of this situation. My client, Tyrone Wilkes, has suffered under this unjust regime. The evidence against him was tainted. From the very beginning, Langford's bias influenced this trial, making it unsafe and unsound." Folding his arms and standing tall, Donnell added, "And I submit that without a fair opportunity for defense, we cannot properly say that justice has been served in this courtroom." For a moment, silence permeated the room. Donnell held his breath, his mind racing with everything that was at stake. Would they see? Finally, the new judge set down the documents, shifting his gaze between Donnell and the jury. "Mr. Hayes," he said slowly, "this is serious evidence you are presenting. Your Honor, we must act. Let us not wait any longer for the scales of justice to right themselves when there are lives hanging in the balance," Donnell pleaded, the urgency rising in his voice. The serious matter laid before him made the judge nod in acknowledgement, and Donnell felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just a fight for Tyrone. This was a fight for the very integrity of their legal system. The room's atmosphere pulsed with possibilities, and Donnell knew they were on the brink of exposing a truth that had been hidden for far too long. Just then, a creak echoed from the back of the courtroom as the doors swung open, and Donnell's heart dropped. The instant recognition sent a rush of adrenaline through him. It was someone connected to the Langfords network, pushing to regain control. The tension spiraled back into the room like wildfire, and Donnell stepped forward, determined to stand firm against whatever was coming, unwilling to let fear creep back in. Tyrone needed him, and so many others did as well. Today, they'd fight not just for innocence but to shine a light on the darkest corners where injustice lurked. As the figure stepped fully into view, Donnell's gut twisted. It was Abigail Trent, a seasoned prosecutor and a known ally to Langford, her expression cold and calculated. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "but I wouldn't count on a victory just yet." Donnell tightened his fists. This was far from over. The stakes had never been higher, and he was just getting started. Donnell stared hard at Abigail Trent, the tension in the courtroom thickening as her presence loomed like a dark cloud. "I wouldn't count on a victory just yet," she had said, her tone icy, filled with an arrogance he'd seen far too often in the halls of justice. "Your Honor, I ask that this court not be swayed by intimidation tactics," Donnell said, forcing his voice to remain steady as he ignored the quizzical murmurs that rippled through the gallery. He could feel the weight of every gaze upon him, each person eager to see how this confrontation would unfold. "Mr. Hayes," the judge interjected, his authority palpable, "do you have reason to believe this woman is disrupting proceedings with malicious intent?" Donnell nodded, his determination fortified by the thought of Tyrone's fate hanging in the balance. "Yes, Your Honor." Ms. Trent was one of Judge Langford's staunchest supporters. She'll use any means necessary to undermine the truth. She knows that an innocent man walks free and will do anything to keep this case alive. Abigail stepped forward, her polished demeanor barely masking a hint of menace. "I'm here to ensure that justice is upheld. My dear Mr. Hayes, maybe your newfound energy comes from wandering too far from the truth. You seek to dismiss facts because they don't align with your narrative. They might not align with yours," Donnell countered sharply, "but facts deserve to be highlighted, not ignored. Tyrone's life, his very freedom, weighs on this moment. As much as you want to protect your mentor's legacy, the law must prevail over personal alliances." "Your Honor," Abigail continued, her voice rising with manufactured indignation, "is this a courtroom or a circus? It's inappropriate to twist the narrative under the pretense of defending someone who has already been labeled guilty by multiple testimonies. The weight of evidence is against Wilkes." Determined not to be rattled, Donnell held his ground. "As if you could claim objectivity, Ms. Trent. The same court that convicted my client is overshadowed by a judge facing serious misconduct charges. Can we really trust any ruling made under those circumstances? Or do you want to keep play-dodging the truth?" The judge's eyes narrowed, assessing the mounting tension before him. "Enough," he commanded, and the room fell silent. "I will not have this courtroom descend into chaos. Mr. Hayes, you may have your rebuttal, but remember to keep it focused on the evidence at hand." Donnell nodded, grateful for the judge's intervention, his heart racing with renewed vigor. "Thank you, Your Honor. The evidence I presented earlier casts light on Langford's record for bias. The dismissals and the call for a new trial, those should not be exchanged for threats under your watch, Ms. Trent. I have fought for justice my entire career, and you will find I will not back down so easily." Abigail's eyes simmered with contempt, but Donnell could see the cracks in her facade, the way she wrestled with her strategy. "Do you really think people will believe an emotional plea over the facts?" "It's adorable," she retorted dismissively, though something deeper flickered behind her cool exterior. The judge focused on the jury, intrigued. "Members of the jury, I urge you to remain objective. The real question at hand is the validity of the charges against Mr. Wilkes. Stay centered in the pursuit of absolute truth." Donnell took a moment to compose himself before continuing. "Let's outline the stakes here clearly. If we allow this case to continue under the shadow of Judge Langford's conduct, we set a precedent that condones malfeasance within our judicial system. What does that mean for the innocent? What does that say about what we stand for?" The murmurs in the gallery suggested an awakening, the sense of unity swelling as Donnell's words hit home. He could see hope returning to Tyrone's eyes, though there remained an undercurrent of fear. Donnell was determined to quell that fear. Abigail wasn't done fighting. "Mr. Hayes, do you imply that the judiciary should bow to public sentiment?" she spat, stepping closer, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "If so, that's a slippery slope, indeed." Donnell matched her intensity, unwavering. "No, Ms. Trent. I'm saying that every court must recognize the sanctity of fair trial and justice for all. That's what we are striving for. I'm not afraid to expose blatant injustices, even if it comes from voices I wish to silence." I will not allow this crooked system to keep my client in prison while the true criminals walk free. At the rear of the courtroom, Lisa appeared through the doorway just as Donnell concluded his fervent plea. She held a stack of documents that gleamed as if the truth within them radiated a light of hope. "Donnell," she said, urgency lacing her voice as she rushed forward. The judge looked toward her, momentarily thrown off by the interruption. "Ms. Trent, step back," Donnell commanded without breaking his flow. "This is what we need." "Your Honor," Lisa began, holding out the documents. "I believe these may uncover the inner workings of Judge Langford's decision-making process. They demonstrate not just bias but a willingness to exploit her position for personal gain." Abigail's expression hardened, flipping rapidly from disdain to fury. "You can't possibly believe you have any valid arguments. The prosecution has already established a timeline of events. Wilkes as the perpetrator, fit for conviction. Help me share this with the jury," Donnell urged Lisa, gesturing to the papers. "These documents will prove that the truth has been buried, not because Tyrone deserves to rot away, but because we've tolerated corruption for too long." The judge raised an eyebrow as Lisa began to pass the papers around. "Your Honor," Donnell said, moving back toward the judge, "we need to show the jury the full scope of Langford's actions. By doing so, they can understand that upholding our justice system means dismantling its flaws." The judge took a deep breath, contemplating the chaos just barely contained. "It's a compelling point, Mr. Hayes," he said slowly. "I will allow this new evidence to be reviewed, but we are racing against the clock." Donnell felt a surge of gratitude toward Lisa for her swift action. Together they had crafted a lifeline for Tyrone, a potential turning point that might set everything right again. As the documents circulated, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, tension transforming into cautious expectancy. Abigail's demeanor began to fray, her grin replaced by a scowl and an air of desperation. "You will find the jury unfavorable to your rousing rhetoric, Donnell," she hissed, but doubt crept into her own words. The judge, regaining authority over the room, brought the court back to order. "Let's review this new evidence and weigh it appropriately." Donnell's heart pounded in his chest, but he felt the resolve build within him. "It's time for the truth," he thought. "It's time to honor those who have suffered, and those who deserve so much more than what was taken from them." As the judge began to sift through the new documents, Donnell took a moment to lock eyes with Tyrone. The two shared a fleeting glance that said more than words could express: resilience, hope, and the unwavering belief in justice. Today was their day, a day of reckoning, a day to shine light on the shadows that had tried to consume them. With renewed purpose, Donnell steadied himself, ready to fight for truth, to advocate for righteousness, and to lead the charge against the legacy of injustice that Judge Langford had left in her wake. Whatever came next would shape their futures and determine whether the scales of justice would finally tilt in favor of those who had long been made to suffer in silence. However, as Donnell prepared to face the oncoming battle, he knew one thing for certain: this time, they wouldn't back down.